Captain Jerome Washington held the telegram in his frozen hands. 3 words typed in capitals: immediate return Conus, continental United States. The war in Europe had 6 weeks left before Germany's final collapse. His artillery battalion had spent 18 months fighting across France and Belgium. Orders to go home now made no sense. Behind him, German artillery shells screamed toward Allied positions 2 miles east. White infantry battalions dug in for another month of combat. Only his men were leaving. January 1945 marked the final winter of World War II in Europe, a period when Allied commanders understood that Nazi Germany's collapse was no longer a question of if but when, as Soviet forces pushed westward through Poland, while American and British armies prepared to cross the Rhine River into Germany's industrial heartland. The European theatre of operations had transformed into a massive grinding machine, consuming men and resources at unprecedented rates, with Allied Supreme Commander General Dwight Eisenhower coordinating more than 4 million soldiers from a dozen nations across a front that stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss Alps. Every available combat unit remained committed to the final offensive that military planners expected would crush German resistance by late April or early May, requiring sustained pressure across all sectors to prevent Nazi commanders from consolidating their remaining forces into defensive positions that could prolong the war through summer or even into autumn of 1945. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion represented one of fewer than 20 all-black combat units that the segregated United States Army had deployed to fight in Europe, a concession forced upon military leadership by political pressure from civil rights organizations and the desperate need for trained soldiers after casualties in 1944 exceeded Pentagon projections by 40%. Captain Jerome Washington commanded Baker Battery, one of 4 firing batteries in the battalion that operated M1 1455mm howitzers, massive artillery pieces capable of hurling 95-pound high-explosive shells more than 11 miles with devastating accuracy, when properly coordinated with forward observers who directed fire onto German positions. Washington had grown up in Philadelphia, where his father worked as a Pullman porter, and his mother cleaned houses in white neighborhoods, attending segregated schools that nevertheless provided him with education sufficient to earn admission to Howard University in 1936, where he studied engineering, before the draft board conscripted him in 1942 and the Army reluctantly commissioned him as an officer after discovering his technical aptitude made him too valuable to waste in a labor battalion. He had survived officer candidate school at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where white instructors failed black candidates at twice the rate of their white counterparts, endured the humiliation of training in the Jim Crow South, where he could not eat in the same restaurants as white privates he outranked, and finally shipped overseas in July 1943, with 319 men who had been told repeatedly by their own army that they lacked the intelligence and courage to fight effectively in modern combat. The battalion's combat record proved those assumptions catastrophically wrong through 18 months of sustained artillery support across some of the European theatre's most brutal campaigns, beginning with their first action during the Allied breakout from Normandy in August 1944, when Baker Battery destroyed 7 German Tiger tanks and 3 infantry positions during a 72-hour bombardment that allowed the 2nd Armored Division to punch through enemy lines near St. Lo. Washington's gun crews established reputations for accuracy and speed that earned respect even from white infantry commanders who had previously expressed doubts about black soldiers' combat effectiveness, firing more than 15,000 rounds during the race across France in late summer and autumn of 1944, while maintaining operational rates that exceeded battalion standards despite receiving inferior equipment and delayed supplies compared to white artillery units. The battalion earned its first unit citation in October 1944, after supporting the liberation of the French city of Nancy, where their counter-battery fire silenced German artillery positions that had pinned down elements of the Third Army for 11 days, and individual soldiers received Bronze Stars for valor after volunteering to repair communications lines under direct enemy fire. By December 1944, the 333rd had participated in 4 major offensives and 17 separate combat actions, suffering 93 casualties including 19 dead, rates comparable to white artillery battalions with similar deployment histories. The German winter offensive in the Ardennes forest that began on December 16, 1944, thrust Washington's battalion into the most intense combat of their deployment when 3 German panzer divisions smashed through American lines in Belgium and Luxembourg, creating the massive bulge in Allied positions that gave the battle its name and threatened to split British and American armies while recapturing the Belgian port of Antwerp. The 333rd received emergency orders to displace forward into positions near Bastogne, where surrounded American forces desperately needed artillery support against German armor and infantry that outnumbered defenders by margins exceeding 3-1 in some sectors. Washington's battery displaced through snowstorms and sub-zero temperatures, with German reconnaissance units operating less than 2 miles from their gun positions, setting up firing points in frozen fields where crews chipped through ice to level their howitzers, while Luftwaffe fighters strafed supply columns attempting to bring forward ammunition. For 19 consecutive days and nights, Baker Battery maintained continuous fire missions, supporting the 101st Airborne Division's defense of Bastogne, firing under conditions where exposed gun crews suffered frostbite casualties and equipment failures, while German artillery targeted their positions with counter-battery fire that killed 6 men and wounded 14 others. The intensity of combat during the Battle of the Bulge exceeded anything Washington or his men had experienced in previous campaigns, with fire missions arriving every 12 to 18 minutes during peak periods, and gun crews loading and firing until their hands bled through their gloves from handling frozen metal components in temperatures that dropped to -15 degrees Fahrenheit. The battalion fired more than 8,000 rounds during the siege of Bastogne, destroying an estimated 47 German tanks and self-propelled guns based on after-action reports from forward observers, along with uncounted infantry positions and supply columns that the high-explosive shells caught in the open during their advance toward American lines. When General George Patton's Third Army broke through German encirclement on December 26th and relieved Bastogne, the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion received official commendation from Division Command for their role in holding the position, with Washington himself receiving the Silver Star for directing fire missions while wounded during a German artillery barrage that struck his command post on December 23rd, killing his executive officer and destroying communications equipment that Washington personally repaired while bleeding from shrapnel wounds in his left shoulder and back. The telegram that arrived on January 9, 1945, contradicted every expectation Washington had formed based on his unit's combat record and the tactical situation in the European theater. Orders typically moved artillery battalions between corps and army sectors based on offensive requirements, with units occasionally rotating to rear areas for equipment maintenance and personnel replacement after sustaining heavy casualties. Full battalion redeployment to the continental United States during active operations violated standard procedure, particularly when the unit showed no signs of combat ineffectiveness and maintained personnel strength above 85% despite recent casualties. Washington read the orders 3 times, searching for clarification that might explain the decision, finding only bureaucratic language about urgent priority redeployment and instructions to cease combat operations immediately, turn over all equipment and ammunition to replacement units, and proceed to a staging area near Cherbourg for transport to the United States aboard the first available convoy. The orders included no explanation for the timing and no indication of what mission awaited the battalion after they reached American soil. Sergeant Theodore Anderson found Washington standing outside the command post, staring at the telegram while snow accumulated on his shoulders and helmet. Anderson had served as the battery's chief fire direction controller since Normandy, a North Carolina tobacco farmer's son who could calculate firing solutions faster than most officers with engineering degrees and who had kept the guns firing during the worst moments at Bastogne, when German artillery had knocked out their primary fire direction center. Anderson had developed a reputation throughout the battalion for reading situations quickly and speaking directly even when that directness might offend officers who preferred careful diplomacy, qualities that Washington valued precisely because they bypassed the layers of deference that segregated military culture imposed on interactions between black soldiers, regardless of rank. Anderson looked at the telegram and then at Washington's face and asked the question that both men already knew had no good answer. Other battalions were staying. Every white artillery unit in their corps remained committed to supporting the final offensive across the Rhine. The 333rd had earned its position through 18 months of combat and 93 casualties, including 19 dead. They had proved themselves at Normandy and Nancy and Bastogne under conditions that broke other units. Orders sending them home 6 weeks before Germany's surrender made tactical sense only if someone had decided that their presence at the victory they had fought to achieve presented a problem requiring immediate solution. Washington folded the telegram and placed it inside his jacket. Orders were orders, regardless of their logic or fairness. The battalion would comply with military discipline, as they had throughout their deployment. They would turn over their guns and their ammunition and their hard-won positions to replacement units who had not spent 18 months earning them. They would march back through France to the coast where they had landed 19 months earlier, full of determination to prove themselves in combat. They would board transport ships, while white soldiers who had suffered fewer casualties and achieved less remained to witness Germany's final defeat. Anderson stood beside Washington in the falling snow, watching German artillery illuminate the eastern horizon, where other men would fight the war's remaining battles. Neither man spoke because both understood that certain truths required no words. The United States Army had sent them to fight fascism in Europe, while maintaining the same racial segregation that Nazi ideology had pushed to its logical conclusion in concentration camps. Now that Army had decided their presence at victory would create complications easier to avoid than to address. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion transferred their howitzers to the 458th Field Artillery Battalion on January 15, 1945, in a muddy field outside Bastogne, where they had defended American lines for 19 days during the German winter offensive. White officers from the replacement unit inspected guns that Washington's crews had maintained under combat conditions, checking maintenance logs without acknowledging the black soldiers who stood beside equipment they had operated under enemy fire for 18 months. The 458th had arrived from the United States 3 weeks earlier, with factory-fresh howitzers, never having fired a shot in combat. Yet their officers processed the transfer with casual authority that assumed their right to inherit positions the 333rd had earned, through 93 casualties including 19 dead. Washington signed transfer documents, while German artillery continued firing 6 miles east, where the war his battalion would not finish, continued without them. The journey from Belgium to the French coast stretched across 8 days as the battalion moved west through territory they had helped liberate 6 months earlier, riding in open cargo beds exposed to winter weather, while white units moving between sectors traveled in enclosed passenger vehicles. Sergeant Theodore Anderson watched Belgian civilians wave at American trucks without knowing these particular soldiers had fought to defend their town and were now being removed from the war before its conclusion. News traveled through the battalion as soldiers compared observations that individually seemed minor, but collectively formed patterns. Corporal Vincent Taylor discovered that 3 other artillery battalions in their corps had received orders for equipment upgrades in preparation for the Rhine crossing offensive. Private First Class Leonard Brooks learned from a white engineer lieutenant that 1st Army Headquarters expected to commit every available artillery battalion to preliminary bombardments before infantry crossed the Rhine. Yet somehow the 333rd had been declared surplus despite their proven performance. The staging area at Cherbourg processed thousands of soldiers returning to the United States, but the 333rd discovered they had been classified differently than other returning personnel. Combat wounded received immediate berths on hospital ships. Technical specialists traveled on faster troop transports, but the 333rd found themselves assigned to a cargo ship with basic accommodations, scheduled to depart when sufficient cargo accumulated, rather than according to urgent priority their orders had specified. Washington spent 4 days attempting to clarify why his battalion had been reclassified. Meetings with logistics officers who confirmed orders appeared legitimate, but offered no explanation for the contradiction between urgency that removed them from combat and lack of urgency that stranded them at Cherbourg. The USS General Richardson departed February 1st, carrying the battalion, along with 8,000 tons of military equipment, in a converted cargo vessel where 307 soldiers bunked in holds with minimal space and failing ventilation systems. The crossing through winter storms lasted 14 days in conditions that contrasted bitterly with their deployment journey 19 months earlier aboard a proper troop transport. No one met the battalion when the ship docked at Newport News, Virginia on February 15th. The dock stood empty except for stevedores loading cargo while the battalion formed ranks in cold rain. A captain distributed orders directing them to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, with instructions to turn in all combat equipment, reducing them to administrative status normally reserved for units being deactivated. The train journey south returned Washington and his men to Jim Crow segregation, riding in designated colored cars at the rear where facilities remained inferior to accommodations provided for white passengers, including German prisoners of war who traveled in standard passenger cars. The battalion arrived at Fort Bragg on February 17th, assigned to the colored section. Wooden barracks with segregated mess halls and recreation facilities where black soldiers remained separate from white troops, who outnumbered them 20-1. Fort Bragg housed more than 60,000 soldiers preparing for Pacific deployment. The 333rd received no training assignments, no orders beyond instructions to await further disposition. Washington spent his first week attempting to meet with base commanders who might clarify his battalion's status, discovering that no one seemed to know or care what happened to a black artillery battalion that had completed combat deployment but remained in service with no assigned mission. The humiliation of returning to segregation after 18 months in Europe, where French civilians had treated black soldiers as liberators, created tensions Washington recognized as dangerous. Corporal Vincent Taylor got arrested by military police after refusing to move to the back of a base bus, spending 3 days in the stockade. Private First Class Leonard Brooks received punishment after a confrontation with a white supply sergeant who called him boy. Brooks responding that he had not been called boy by German soldiers, he had fought for 18 months and would not accept that form of address from Americans who had never left the continental United States. The incidents multiplied through late February and early March, as men who had operated artillery under fire at Bastogne found themselves subjected to petty regulations by white soldiers who had never heard shots fired in anger. Washington stood outside battalion headquarters on March 8th, reading orders that finally clarified their status. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion would be deactivated, effective March 31st. All personnel would receive 30 days leave before reassignment or discharge. No explanation accompanied the deactivation order. No mention of their combat record or reasons they had been removed from Europe 6 weeks before Germany's surrender. The battalion that had fought at Normandy and Nancy and Bastogne would simply cease to exist. Washington folded the orders and placed them in his pocket. Sergeant Anderson found him 20 minutes later, staring at rain while white soldiers drove past in trucks, marked for units deploying overseas. Neither man spoke, because both understood that some truths remained too bitter for words. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion no longer existed. The truth emerged 47 years later in classified documents that the Department of Defense released under Freedom of Information Act requests filed by military historians researching the treatment of black combat units during World War II. A memorandum dated December 28, 1944, from the Office of the Adjutant General to European Theatre of Operations Headquarters, identified specific concerns about Negro troops who had served extended combat deployments in France and Belgium, warning that these soldiers had experienced treatment as equals by French civilians and had observed racial integration in certain Allied units that contradicted the segregated structure that Army leadership considered essential for maintaining discipline and morale among white troops. The memorandum recommended immediate redeployment of selected Negro combat units before the final victory in Europe, specifically targeting those units whose soldiers had developed what the document described as inappropriate expectations regarding their status in American society based on their combat service and their interactions with European civilians who did not share American attitudes about racial separation. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, appeared on a list of 7 Negro units recommended for urgent removal, identified not because of combat ineffectiveness or discipline problems, but precisely because their successful performance and their soldiers' positive relationships with French civilians created what Pentagon officials characterized as potential threats to post-war racial stability. The deeper reasoning behind the December memorandum remained buried in additional classified documents that military historians discovered in archives at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, Missouri, during research conducted in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Staff officers in the War Department's G1 Personnel Section had analyzed reports from military intelligence officers embedded with Negro combat units throughout the European theater, compiling assessments of how combat experience and exposure to European social conditions might affect these soldiers' attitudes when they returned to the Jim Crow South and other regions where racial segregation governed daily life through both legal structures and social customs. The intelligence reports noted that Negro soldiers frequently expressed surprise and gratitude when French civilians invited them into homes for meals, treated them with the same respect shown to white American soldiers, and in some cases developed romantic relationships with French women who did not view racial difference as barrier to social interaction. Officers monitoring Negro troop morale reported conversations where soldiers compared their treatment by French civilians favorably to their experiences in the United States, discussions that intelligence analysts flagged as evidence of developing attitudes that could inspire resistance to segregation when these men returned home with combat records proving their courage and capability under the same conditions that tested white soldiers. The most disturbing element of the classified documents involved Pentagon concerns about Negro soldiers who had participated in the liberation of Nazi concentration camps or who had witnessed the aftermath of German racial extermination policies that killed 6 million Jews along with millions of Roma, political prisoners, and others whom Nazi ideology deemed inferior. Captain Jerome Washington and elements of Baker Battery had entered the Dachau concentration camp on May 1, 1945, 3 weeks after the battalion's official deactivation, but while Washington remained on active duty processing final administrative paperwork, attached temporarily to a white artillery unit that supported 7th Army operations in southern Germany. Washington had volunteered for the assignment because remaining on active duty postponed his return to Philadelphia, where he would need to explain to his mother why the Army had sent him home before the war ended, and because some part of him needed to see the conclusion of the conflict he had fought for 18 months, even if official records would never credit his presence at Germany's final defeat. Dachau had been liberated by the 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions on April 29th, but Washington's temporary assignment brought him to the camp 2 days later, when Army medical units struggled to provide care for more than 30,000 survivors who suffered from typhus, tuberculosis, starvation, and injuries inflicted during 12 years of Nazi imprisonment. The camp sprawled across nearly 40 acres, surrounded by electrified barbed wire fences and guard towers that remained standing as evidence of the systematic cruelty that German civilians living less than 2 miles away claimed they had never suspected, despite the smoke from crematorium chimneys and the freight trains that had delivered hundreds of thousands of prisoners over more than a decade. Washington walked through barracks, where skeletal survivors lay on wooden bunks stacked 3 levels high in buildings designed to house 50 prisoners, but packed with 300 human beings reduced to walking corpses by deliberate starvation, disease, and brutality that exceeded anything he had witnessed during 18 months of combat against German military forces. He saw piles of corpses stacked like cordwood waiting for burial because camp authorities had murdered prisoners faster than they could dispose of bodies, and he stood in gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, where Zyklon B poison had killed thousands of people whose only crime had been their Jewish ancestry, or their political beliefs, or their Roma ethnicity, or their refusal to conform to Nazi demands for absolute ideological conformity. The experience of witnessing Dachau's horrors fundamentally altered Washington's understanding of what he had been fighting against during 18 months in Europe, revealing that the Nazi ideology that American propaganda had condemned as evil and tyrannical extended far beyond military aggression into a comprehensive system of racial hierarchy that classified entire categories of human beings as subhuman and therefore appropriate targets for enslavement, exploitation, and extermination. Washington recognized uncomfortable parallels between Nazi racial theories that declared Jews and Roma inferior by biological destiny and American segregation laws that declared Negroes inferior by nature, systems that both relied on pseudoscientific claims about racial difference to justify legal structures preventing intermarriage, education, and equal participation in society. The gas chambers and crematoriums represented the ultimate conclusion of racial ideology, taken to its logical extreme. But the fundamental assumption that some humans deserved fewer rights than others based on ancestry appeared disturbingly similar between Nazi Germany and the Jim Crow South, where Washington had grown up under laws that prohibited him from attending school with white children, eating in the same restaurants as white adults, or voting in elections that determined government policies affecting his life. Military intelligence officers assigned to monitor Negro troops' reactions to concentration camp discoveries filed reports noting that these soldiers frequently made explicit comparisons between Nazi racial policies and American segregation, conversations that Pentagon analysts identified as evidence of radicalization that could inspire civil rights activism when these veterans returned to the United States with combat records and organizational experience gained through military service. A classified assessment dated May 15, 1945, warned that Negro veterans who had witnessed Nazi concentration camps would possess powerful rhetorical ammunition for challenging racial segregation in the United States, able to argue that America had fought a war against racist ideology in Europe while maintaining its own system of racial oppression at home. The report recommended careful monitoring of these veterans and suggested that military leadership consider strategies for limiting their influence when they return to civilian life, including dispersing them geographically rather than allowing them to concentrate in urban areas where civil rights organizations might recruit them as organizers and spokesmen whose combat service would give them credibility that civilian activists lacked. The Army's solution involved bureaucratic mechanisms that appeared neutral, but effectively isolated Negro veterans and limited their ability to organize collectively for social change. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion's deactivation on March 31, 1945, scattered its personnel across the United States during their 30-day leaves before reassignment, sending them to hometowns and cities where they returned as individuals rather than as members of a cohesive unit that had shared combat experience and developed bonds of trust and mutual support during 18 months under fire. The dispersal prevented battalion reunions and made it difficult for veterans to maintain contact in an era before widespread telephone access or affordable long-distance communication, breaking apart social networks that might have evolved into organizing structures for civil rights activism. Veterans who returned to the South found themselves subjected to immediate reassertion of Jim Crow segregation enforced by white civilians who viewed Negro veterans' military service as threatening rather than honorable. Incidents where white bus drivers demanded that uniformed Negro soldiers move to the back of buses, and white police officers arrested Negro veterans who challenged segregation ordinances despite their recent service fighting fascism in Europe. But the Pentagon's strategy of dispersal and isolation could not completely suppress the impact that combat experience and exposure to Nazi racial atrocities had on men who returned to segregated America with new understanding of how racial hierarchies functioned and new determination to challenge systems that declared them inferior based on ancestry rather than individual capability. Captain Jerome Washington returned to Philadelphia in April 1945 and enrolled at Temple University Law School using GI Bill education benefits, determined to acquire legal training that would allow him to fight segregation through courtroom battles, rather than accepting the racial status quo his father's generation had endured. Sergeant Theodore Anderson went home to North Carolina and began organizing Negro veterans into voting rights groups that challenged poll taxes and literacy tests designed to prevent black citizens from participating in elections. Using the organizational skills he had developed coordinating artillery fire at Bastogne, to build political networks that registered thousands of Negro voters across rural counties, where white supremacist politicians had maintained power through systematic disenfranchisement. Corporal Vincent Taylor moved to New York City and joined the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, becoming a field organizer who traveled through the South documenting lynchings and racial violence while recruiting local activists into civil rights campaigns that would explode into national prominence during the 1950s and 60s. The transformation of combat veterans into civil rights activists occurred gradually across the decade following World War II, as men who had fought Nazi racism in Europe returned home to confront American segregation with new perspectives shaped by their military service and their exposure to racial ideologies taken to murderous conclusions in concentration camps. Washington argued cases before Pennsylvania courts challenging restrictive housing covenants that prevented Negro families from purchasing homes in white neighborhoods, winning legal victories that established precedents later cited in landmark Supreme Court decisions dismantling Jim Crow laws. Anderson organized the protest that became the Greensboro sit-in movement in 1960, when 4 Negro college students refused to leave a segregated lunch counter, a direct action campaign that Anderson helped plan, based on tactical principles he had learned coordinating artillery support for infantry assaults during the war. Taylor documented the murder of Emmett Till in Mississippi in 1955 and organized the national publicity campaign that forced America to confront the brutal reality of racial violence in the South, using investigative skills he had developed, gathering intelligence about German positions during combat operations in Belgium and France. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion had been deactivated in March 1945 to prevent its soldiers from participating in Germany's final defeat and to disperse them before they could develop collective consciousness about the contradictions between fighting fascism abroad and tolerating racial oppression at home. The Pentagon had calculated that removing them from Europe and scattering them across the United States would neutralize whatever radical ideas military service and exposure to European attitudes might have inspired, protecting segregation from veterans who might question why they had risked death fighting Nazi racial ideology, while their own country maintained legal systems declaring them second-class citizens. But the strategy failed because it fundamentally misunderstood what combat experience and witnessing concentration camps had taught these soldiers about the nature of racial hierarchy and the necessity of resistance. The army had wanted them silent and compliant. It had created men who understood that the fight against fascism did not end with Germany's surrender, but continued in every segregated bus, every discriminatory law, every act of racial violence that American society tolerated or encouraged. The 333rd had been disbanded. Its soldiers would spend the next 2 decades destroying the segregation that their premature removal from Europe had been designed to protect. The decade following World War II transformed American society through legal battles and direct action campaigns that systematically dismantled segregation structures, and veterans of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion stood at the forefront precisely because their combat service had given them organizational experience, tactical discipline, and moral authority that civilian activists could not match when confronting white supremacist resistance. Captain Jerome Washington argued his first major civil rights case in Pennsylvania State Court in 1948, challenging restrictive covenants that prevented Negro families from purchasing homes in Philadelphia neighborhoods where property deeds forbade sale to anyone not of Caucasian race, legal instruments that developers had used since the 1920s to maintain residential segregation even in northern cities without explicit Jim Crow statutes. Washington represented the Richardson family, who faced lawsuits from white neighbors demanding enforcement of racial covenants, and during 3 days of testimony, he systematically destroyed legal foundations supporting restrictive covenants by demonstrating that Pennsylvania courts enforcing private racial discrimination were acting as instruments of state-sponsored segregation, violating the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled in Washington's favor in November 1948, establishing legal precedent that influenced the United States Supreme Court's decision in Shelley v. Kramer, a landmark ruling that prohibited judicial enforcement of racial covenants nationwide and opened previously segregated neighborhoods to Negro families across the country. Washington had won by applying the same analytical precision he had used calculating artillery trajectories at Bastogne, and his military bearing gave him credibility with judges who might have dismissed similar arguments from civilian Negro attorneys. The victory established his reputation and led to recruitment by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where he collaborated with Thurgood Marshall on school desegregation cases culminating in Brown versus Board of Education, the 1954 Supreme Court decision that declared segregated public schools unconstitutional and began the legal dismantling of Jim Crow throughout the South. Sergeant Theodore Anderson returned to North Carolina and discovered his military service meant nothing to white civilians who controlled political power where Negro citizens could not vote because of poll taxes, literacy tests, and violence. Anderson began organizing Negro veterans into voter registration groups in 1946, adapting infantry assault tactics to registration campaigns by identifying targets like county courthouses, conducting reconnaissance to understand barriers, and coordinating systematic efforts to overcome those barriers through group action. His groups organized carpools to transport citizens to courthouses, pooled money to pay poll taxes, and conducted literacy classes, preparing applicants to pass tests that white registrars administered selectively. The campaigns succeeded slowly, as Anderson's groups registered thousands of Negro voters across rural counties, creating political infrastructure that supported lunch counter sit-ins during the civil rights movement's peak years. Anderson's most significant contribution came in February 1960, when 4 Negro college students sat at a segregated Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro and refused to leave, an act that inspired similar protests across the South. The students consulted Anderson before launching their protest, and he spent 2 weeks teaching them tactical principles, including clear objectives, maintaining discipline under pressure, and backup plans. Anderson explained that successful operations required accepting casualties would occur, but ensuring those casualties achieved strategic objectives, helping students develop protocols for nonviolent resistance that would protect them while generating publicity, making continued segregation politically unsustainable. Corporal Vincent Taylor moved to New York City and joined the NAACP National Office, where his combat experience made him valuable as field investigator, documenting racial violence that local authorities refused to prosecute. Taylor spent a decade traveling through Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana, interviewing witnesses to lynchings, photographing burned churches, and compiling evidence that civil rights attorneys used in federal lawsuits. His military training proved essential for surviving work in confrontation with white supremacists, and his experience navigating hostile territory taught him how to gather intelligence while minimizing exposure to retaliation. Taylor's most important investigation documented the murder of Emmett Till in Mississippi in August 1955, a 14-year-old Negro boy tortured and killed by white men who claimed he whistled at a white woman. Local authorities conducted perfunctory investigations, producing no charges, despite overwhelming evidence. Taylor arrived 3 days after Till's body was pulled from the Tallahatchie River and spent 2 weeks interviewing witnesses, photographing evidence, and documenting systematic cover-up. The evidence Taylor compiled contradicted official narratives, and his photographs of Till's mutilated body forced national media to confront brutal reality of racial violence. Taylor coordinated with Till's mother to publish photographs in Jet magazine, images that shocked Americans and contributed to growing political pressure for federal intervention. The Till case became a catalyst for the modern civil rights movement by demonstrating that segregation depended on violence. Private First Class Leonard Brooks returned to Alabama and found work teaching in segregated Negro schools, receiving a fraction of funding allocated to white schools. Brooks spent 15 years organizing Negro parents to demand equal funding, campaigns leading to federal lawsuits challenging Alabama's dual school system. Brooks testified in federal court in Montgomery in 1963, providing detailed documentation of disparities, including class sizes exceeding 50 students in Negro schools, while white schools maintained ratios below 25, buildings where temperatures dropped below freezing, and textbooks decades outdated. Federal judges cited his evidence when ordering Alabama to immediately equalize educational funding, establishing precedent that accelerated school desegregation across the Deep South. The impact that veterans of the 333rd exerted on the civil rights movement extended beyond individual achievements to include the example they provided for younger activists. Washington's courtroom victories demonstrated legal strategies could dismantle discriminatory laws. Anderson's voter registration campaigns proved systematic organizing could overcome violence. Taylor's investigations forced national attention onto racial violence Southern authorities had hidden. Brooks's educational advocacy showed persistent pressure could compel state governments to honor constitutional obligations. These men transformed combat experience into civil rights activism that accelerated social change during critical decades when American democracy confronted the fundamental contradiction between professed ideals of equality and actual practices of racial subordination. The Pentagon's strategy of removing the 333rd from Europe before Germany's surrender and deactivating the battalion had failed completely by the early 1960s, when veterans helped lead the movement that destroyed Jim Crow throughout the South. Military leadership calculated that dispersing these soldiers would prevent them from organizing. But the calculation ignored how combat experience transformed men's understanding of what was possible when disciplined groups pursued strategic objectives against overwhelming opposition. The Army had wanted compliant veterans who accepted segregation as natural order. It had created tacticians who understood how to analyze complex systems, identify critical vulnerabilities, and coordinate sustained campaigns, achieving objectives through persistence. The 333rd had been sent home to protect segregation from their presence at Europe's liberation. Instead, they had returned to liberate America from the racial hierarchy that military leadership tried to preserve. The Army had thought it was protecting segregation. In truth, it was creating the men who would destroy it.